our very special guests, namely Anke Hassel and Bruno Palier, who will present their brand new book on models of growth. And we'll have three discussants, Emmanuele Pavolini, Stefano Sacchi, and Luigi Burroni. I just briefly introduce our guests, starting from Anke. She has a Master's of Science in Industrial Relations from the London School of Economics and a PhD in Sociology. Now she's at the Hertie School of Government in Berlin, and she's been working in the wide field of comparative political and economy, particularly concerning labor market regulation, training, and industrial relations. Then we have Bruno Palier. He has a PhD in political science and is now a research director at the Science Po. And his work has been mostly on comparative political economy, comparative public policies with particular concern to welfare reforms. Okay, I won't take any more time. I'd like to thank our guests and Cecilia, who is the hidden force behind our webinars. And now the floor goes to Anke and Bruno. Thank you very much for being our guests.
Thank you for this very kind invitation and also for the invitation to be able to present our work here. I hope you can see the slides.
We do.
You can see the slides, you can see the book and the book cover. So thank you very much. Bruno and I will present our book jointly. I will start and Bruno will take over. And as an introduction, I would like to mention that this book took a long time to complete. We started more than, I think, 6 years ago, starting thinking about the issues. And I think the fact that it has taken quite a long time also sort of says something about the genesis of the entire project, because when we started thinking about the issue, the connections between growth regimes on the one hand and changes in the welfare state and the role of governments using growth strategies and in reforming the welfare state, this was at the time when the discussion about the varieties of capitalism had really be at an end point, and there was not so much dynamics anymore in understanding different types of capitalism. And people sort of moved on from this perspective. And it was the time when people started talking about growth models. And you might be familiar with also the work by Jonas Pontusson and Luigi Baccardo on growth models to develop a different approach of how to understand the different kinds of capitalist economies. So this is where we were in the sort of 2015, 2016. We started working on this. We started gathering a group of authors around us and trying to understand what was happening in a more dynamic perspective. So how can we understand the development of different models of capitalism, but also how can we understand the development of the welfare state? And the project we came up with and have been working over the last 5 years is really comes in two parts. And the book we're presenting today is the first part of this project. And this is more the conceptual parts in trying to think and get an understanding of how growth regimes have evolved. And we have selected a number of really good authors. So in the book, you find chapters by Peter Hall, but also by Luigi Baccardo and Jonas Pontusson talking about growth models. We have a chapter by Georg Picot, Fritz Sharp, who's writing about the Eurozone, Kathy Thiel, who's presenting a chapter on different trajectories of the transition to the knowledge economy, comparing the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. We have a chapter by Kathy Jo Martin looking at the Capacity Act of the business community. We have a chapter by Anne Ran, who is looking at the role of skills, in particular when it comes to the transition to the service economy, and she talks about the dynamic services and non-dynamic services. There's a chapter, and then we have a sort of number of sort of more policy-related chapters. One is by Alison Johnston, who looks at wage-setting institutions and wage bargaining regimes. Alexander Reisenbichler, who works on housing and the role of housing in the development of growth regimes. Tom Chevalier, who looks at youth policies. And at the end, we have another chapter by ourselves and Sonia Avlias, and where we look at more empirical evidence for the claim we're making. So this is the first part of this project, and this is in this book. And what we are hoping to do and what we are preparing at the moment is a second volume of the same theme, and this looks at country studies. And here again, we have collected a number of people who are very knowledgeable on specific growth regimes in their particular countries. So Hermann Schwarz is writing a chapter on the US. Then we have Mu-Po Chung, who writes about South Korea. Robert Boyer is looking at China, and which he did a very interesting chapter on how the Chinese welfare state is embedded in the Chinese economic development. Jon Erik Dolvik writes about the Nordic countries. Jette Sten Knudsen and Christian Ibsen about Denmark. Katharina Blum, who looks at the Russian model. And both Russia and China really do not feature in our first book because we looked at the Western OECD countries, but we thought in the second volume it is important to look at other economic development models, in particular China and Russia, which is much more based on a resource-based economic model. Then we have a chapter on Greece by George Pagoulatos and Christos Tiantopoulos. Adrian Regan writes about Ireland. I have a chapter on Germany. Bruno has a chapter on France, so we write on the things we know about, and Sonia Avlias writes about Eastern Europe. So this is the overall setup of the entire project, and the first volume has now been published. And here you should see the content, which you probably do not see. Yeah, here it is. And this is just the title of these various chapters, and I don't have to go through that again because I just mentioned that. So what is the core message of the book? Just to give you a heads up and to put it in a nutshell what this book is all about. The starting point is really that we do not see, despite several decades of talking about liberalization and the role of neoliberalism, we do not see much of a convergence of welfare systems. What we do see is that welfare systems change, but they do not necessarily change in the same direction and in the same way. They all specialize and they all transform in their own way. And we're trying to understand why that is. If we say we're all facing the same challenges, all these welfare states face the challenge of demographic aging, the challenge of globalization, the challenge of deindustrialization, so the decline of manufacturing industries, the rise of the service economy, but also the rise of financialization and the rise of the digital economy. So the challenge are pretty much the same in all the countries, but the responses are different. And we were trying to figure out why that is. Why do we have so different responses and different trajectories in welfare systems across the OECD countries? And our hunch was, and that was our working hypothesis all along, and this is the main sort of message in the book, is to say that we have to understand the trajectories of growth regimes if we want to understand the trajectory of the welfare state. And our assumption is that these are very closely connected with each other, that the welfare state is a foundation of growth models in various countries, and at the same time that governments use the welfare state in order to facilitate growth in various ways. And I will say a little bit about in which ways the governments can do that in a moment. But this is really the starting point of the entire book, is to say, we really have to understand the relationship between the two, the growth regimes on the one hand, and the welfare state on the other hand. And growth regimes evolve because government's actions are based on specific growth strategies. So each government has to face the problem of employment and has to face the problem of incomes, people's incomes. And they want to use, they're looking actively, searching for strategies to facilitate growth because they know that growth will solve some of their problems. If you have economic growth, then you can boost employment, you can pay for the welfare state, and you have higher tax revenues. So growth strategies are on the mind of governments. And they use these growth strategies, and by using these using growth strategies and developing them, they use the welfare state. They tweak the welfare state, they change welfare states, they reform the welfare state in order to produce growth. This is our main claim. Welfare reforms have to be seen in the context of growth regimes. And the final point we try to make, and this is in the wider discussion about the evolution of advanced industrialized economies and the politics of the evolution of advanced industrial economies, is that it is not just based on electoral concerns, and it's not just based on electoral pressure by various groups, but it is really driven by producer groups. And by producer groups, we mean coalitions between business, but also trade unions, who jointly try to protect their industries and to boost their industries, and thereby drive on growth strategies and nudge governments and lobby governments to adopt certain measures in order to boost growth strategies. So this is our book in a nutshell. And what we will do in this presentation, we will start with a couple of puzzles. We will then explain the relationship between growth regimes and the welfare state. And then thirdly, and this is when Bruno will take over, we will look at old and new engines for growth. We will talk about financialization. We will talk about the digital economy. And then we will introduce the notion of growth strategies and link that to welfare state reforms. And at the very end, we will say something about the politics, as I just mentioned, the relationship between electoral pressure on the one hand and producer group politics on the other hand. So what are the puzzles? And the puzzles are really the variety of developments and policy decisions in different OECD welfare states. And one way to look at it is if we look at public and private pensions and the contributions to private pension plans compared to public pension plans. And what you see here is that there is a big variety in the use of public pensions vis-a-vis private pensions and private pension funds when it comes to the organization of pension policies. And if you look at the Italian case is a case where public benefits are almost the highest. Greece has, at least in 2001, but Italy was the country which had the highest level of public benefits. And only in 2013, Greece sort of overtook Italy, but it is an extreme case that is heavily reliant on public pensions. If you look at the German case is not far apart from the Italian case, and France similarly is also a country which is heavily reliant on public pension schemes. If we then move further to the right, we see how public pension schemes go down, and at the same time, private pension schemes increase, and the role of private pensions becomes more and more important. And if we look at how this has developed over time, we can see that Italy stays a heavily public a scheme which is heavily reliant on public contributions. But then if we compare to Denmark has actually changed quite significantly. And if you look at the evolution of private benefits between 2001 and 2013 in Denmark, you see that this has increased quite substantially. And also in other countries, you see the rise of private pension contributions in the United States. We're not so surprised about that. But also, if you move further to the right, you look at the Netherlands, again, you see an increase, a substantial increase in benefits and contributions of private pensions. And this development, we cannot really explain by electoral politics, and we cannot really explain by electoral dynamics. There must be another explanation for these very different trajectories these countries are on. Italy, Greece, France, Germany, on the one hand, heavily reliant on public pensions, but then in other countries, in particular Denmark, most of the Nordic countries, we see a rise of private pensions, but also in the liberal market economy in the United Kingdom, the US, we see a substantial increase in private pensions. So this is a puzzle we want to understand. Another example for the puzzle is if we look at the varieties of social investment, and this is based on a project by Anton Hemmerich at EUI, who looks at different kinds of social investment. And he looks at the relationship between the employment rate on the one hand, so countries with very high employment, and the Gini index on the other hand, and he looks at the composition of social spending, either cash transfers or benefits in kind. And what you see is that there are very different worlds out there. So you have countries with very high employment and very equitable countries on the one hand, and these are the Nordic countries, plus Netherlands and to some extent Germany. But on the other hand, you have more Southern European countries where the employment rate is much lower, but also equality is much lower, and where you find much more cash transfers, whereas in the other countries, you have much more benefits in kinds. So we still have a big variety of very different kinds of welfare states, and these gaps are not getting closer. So these are the puzzles. And our argument is that it is not just electoral politics, and it is also not just path dependence which can explain these developments. What we have to understand in addition to that are economic strategies. And this is what we do in our paper, in our book. So growth regimes and the welfare state. And here we develop the argument, which is really already based in the literature on welfare capitalism. You remember the contribution by Esping-Andersen on welfare capitalism. And we take welfare capitalism seriously in the way that we think about to what extent can the welfare state actually explain economic development. So looking at the welfare state literature, and most of the welfare state literature, we see that it is not very well equipped to explain the relationship between economic models and social policies and welfare systems. But it has much more to do, or is much more based on issues of modernization, but also issues of salience of policy issues or electoral pressure. And it is only when we look at Esping-Andersen's contributions, the politics against markets contribution, that we talk about issues of decommodification, of retrenchment, of austerities and cuts, of neoliberalism. And the argument behind that is to say governments cut social spending in order to vitalize markets, in order to make supply side reforms, and therefore in order to induce growth via supply side policies. But what we also realize, or have to realize, is that there's also another view of the welfare state, which says that the contributions by the welfare states are actually the foundation for economic activities. And this is a perspective which can explain the emergence of social insurances as a beneficial contribution to economic activity. It also can explain and help to explain the role of Keynesian welfare states, but also the role of social investment as positive contributions to the evolution of the welfare state. And our step is the next step after welfare capitalism to say what we need to understand are really the underlying growth regimes and the interaction between the growth regimes and welfare state policies. So what are growth regimes? So in our introductory chapter, we introduce the notion of growth regimes, and we argue that this is the mode of governance of the economy. So it's a very broad perspective. But we say that a growth regime has really three components. And the first component of a growth regime is the engine of growth. And the engine of growth really denotes a particular sector in which an economy specializes in. And this sector contributes to wealth creation, but also to job creation in a particular economy. And all economies have a mixture of agriculture, manufacturing, services, and in services we have high and low value-added services, etc. But each economy has a particular industry that it is particularly good at. And if you look at France, we look at luxury production. If you look at Germany, we look at manufacturing, the car industry, but some also engineering industry. And if you look at the UK, we look at financial services. So particular sectors are the engine of growth, and governments will try to protect the engine of growth of an economy because they're dependent on this particular sector. And at the very bottom, we have the main components of aggregate demand. And the components of aggregate demand can either be private consumption, and private consumptions can be either households or firms. It can be public consumption, but it also can be export driven. And in the remainder of the chapter, we make a big distinction between either domestic demand driven economies or export driven economies, because it makes a difference on the economic strategy a government will pursue. But it's interesting is the bit in the middle. And the bit in the middle is about the institutions that organize the economy. And when we look at these institutions, and that is what you see here, these socioeconomic institutions, we identify, based on the work of Bruno Palier, we identify three major fields of socioeconomic institutions which are crucial for a growth regime. And this is product market regulation. This is the area of corporate governance and the financial system. But these are also wage setting and labor market regulations. This is education and training. And this is the whole sphere of social protection. And when you look at it more closely, you realize that in particular, the bottom three are all parts of the welfare state. And these socioeconomic institutions, they interact with both the supply side of the economy and the demand side of the economy. And if we sort of forget about product market regulation and financial system for a moment, because they're not part of the welfare state, and if we look at only the bottom three different socioeconomic institutions, namely the wage setting system, the social protection system, and the education and training system, we see that it actually matters how wages are set. Because if you have higher wages, you affect the demand side, you get wage-driven demand. But if you set wages too high, you add to labor costs. You have higher labor costs, and that might be a negative effect for the supply side of your economy. And the same is true for the social protection system. The social protection system, if it is generous, it can provide an automatic stabilizer. If the economy hits a recession, the social protection system will cover the expenses and the income of many people, so it will keep the demand side up. If it is too high and people have to pay too high contributions into social protection system, it adds to labor costs and therefore has a negative effect on the economy. And finally, we also have an impact of education and training as a socioeconomic institution that affects the demand side on the one hand, because it shapes consumer behavior, and higher education leading to higher income also has an effect on the demand side. And on the supply side, it is related to skills. So these are the three socioeconomic institutions that are crucial for a growth regime because they interact between they link the supply side of an economy with the demand side of the economy. And the role of welfare system in growth regimes, or the role of social policies in growth regimes, point to key areas of social policy reforms. And just to name three of them, if we tinker with minimum wages, if you introduce minimum wages, the level you set minimum wages will affect your wage setting system, and it will affect your economy either on the demand side or on the supply side. And the same is true for social insurances, the coverage of social insurances, the degree to which it replaces income. And the same is true for social investment. Social investment meaning here education and training, because it affects the skill set on the one hand, and it affects the education and income capacity on the other hand. And I now hand over to Bruno, who will talk about old and new engines of growth.
Yes, if you can unshare so that I will put it so that I can play with my clicker. Okay, thank you very much. I have shown in there in the chat that we have also published actually before the book was out in Italian prestigious journal some of our ideas in Stato e Mercato, and we would like to thank you again for having invited us a year or something ago to present it. Okay, so the idea is that we want to understand the dynamic of growth regimes, and according to our definition of growth regimes, we need to look at the engines of growth, even though, as Anke said, it's not the only component of growth regime, but it is. And if we go back to historical trajectories, actually, we slightly disagree with the current state of the literature, which is used to say, especially Baccaro and Potusson, which is to say diversification comes from after Fordism, in the post-Fordist era. And in the Fordist era, everything was led by wage increase, and it was a wage-led growth. And actually, if we go back to history, we see that indeed, in countries like the US, UK, Italy, or France, you had a clearly wage-led growth during the Fordist era, with welfare spending, with a Keynesian welfare state, with a mass production and mass consumption, and with, if not no limit, at least a lax on wage increase. Whereas if you go back to the 50s, you see debates in Germany about the fact that if you had too much growth of wage, you would have inflation that was a bad thing. And you had both the Bundesbank, the IG Metall, who said we don't want that because it would ruin our exporting capacities, and also we don't want hyperinflation. And as we know from Peter Katzenstein, small countries have never been a great fan of wage inflation because they were preoccupied by their competitiveness right from the start. It's even there that Katzenstein start to theorize coordination in market economies in small countries. Therefore, we point to the fact that right in the 50s and perhaps even before, in the 20th century, you already can distinguish between demand-led and export-driven growth models or growth strategies with this type of countries. And actually, in a way, we have the various worlds of welfare capitalism, which are already inscribed in this bifurcation that is visible in the history. If now we look closer, we see that this distinction continues. These are data gathered for the period 1997-2007, so before the financial crisis. And what we see more or less clearly that beyond the usual four cases studied by Baccaro and Potusson, which are Germany, Sweden, UK, and Italy, beyond these four cases, there is a confirmation that if we look at more countries, it's a kind of either or. Here you are more preoccupied by your current account, so your exportability, your capacity to export, and here you are more preoccupied by your capacity to increase domestic demand through wages or other things, and we'll come back to that. And in our book, we confirm this idea that it's very relevant to distinguish between export and domestic demand. There is our paper here. There is a paper by Georg Picot. These are absolutely, and of course, Jonas Pontusson and Lucio Baccaro, but we would be surprised if they were writing something else in our book. But we confirm that this is absolutely a key distinction. However, this is still dual, binary, and we think that we have to complexify things by looking at how these various models or various regimes have traveled through two big trends that have marked capitalism since the 80s. It's financialization and computerization, digitalization. So we're trying to measure the degree of financialization and the degree of digitalization of these various economies. So we use various types of indicators that are mentioned here. We look at saving rates, house price inflation, pension funds. We know that out of Colin Crouch, house price inflation is a big part of the financialization or privatized Keynesianism type of model. As far as digital transformation, we look at how much investment in ICT you can find by firms, but also by the global economy and government, and also how many jobs in ICT you have. And what you see is that we believe that these two things, finance and ICT, are new engines for growth. They create for finance the wealth effect that has been theorized by many, amongst them Robert Boyer. Financialization creates the capacity to have assets, and these assets create a sense of, and the economy recognizes a sense of wealth that you can bet on, especially when you have a vibrant mortgage market and system. If we look at digitalization, we know a lot of things about disruption, new forms of value creation, new forms of jobs. What we point in our chapter is that these two are connected, interconnected, finance and ICT. This is shown in this graph, is that the more indicators of financialization you have, the more also you find jobs in ICT and investment. And here, I come back on this graph to point to a paradox, which is you have a lot of a high degree of digitalization in both liberal economies, typically financialized economies, but also in the Nordic countries. And we realize here that the Nordic countries are also highly financialized. If you look at pension funds as an indicator, but there are also private debt or other indicators that show that it's not only liberal countries. So it's more complicated than just CME, LMEs if we want to understand the current situation. So out of that, we draw a first distinction between growth regimes, how they fared through financialization and ICT. And what we find is 4 groups of countries. Those who have been highly financialized with a negative trade balance. These are countries with, on our indicators, a level of low saving rate, high price inflation for housing, pension funds are very high, negative current account. And you will find typical LMEs in there. So US, UK, and a few other English-speaking countries. Then you have countries who have also a relatively high level of financialization, but positive trade balance. So they are export-led economies, but also highly financialized. And you have the Nordic countries and the Netherlands here. And you see here that this distinction allows to go beyond the either CME or LME, or beyond the only export-led or only domestic demand-led economies. Then we have the countries who have low financialization and high export. This is and low export. Sorry, you have a mixed pattern with low coverage of private pension funds, low saving rate, relatively low house price inflation, and you find that in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. As far as the data are good for Eastern Europe, it's not totally true. And then we have the least financialized, but largely export-led systems, mostly exporting manufacturing industrial goods: Germany, Austria, Japan, South Korea, Switzerland, France, and Belgium. So this is the first distinction that we do in terms of where growth regimes have gone. Of course, this is a snapshot. There is no mechanism here, and we try to understand the mechanisms. So we deduct from these 4 groups, actually 5 growth regimes. The ones who are strong exporters based on the manufacturing export, where you have low domestic demand, strong export, and these are the countries. A balanced model, to use Baccarat and Pontusson wording, the Nordic countries, Sweden, but also Luxembourg and the Netherlands, where you have both a combination of high domestic demand and strong export. Then you have the export focus but weak in in capacities. This is Eastern Europe. You have high domestic demand. You have an export focus, but a negative current account yet. Private demand is strong in Anglo-Saxon countries, but weak on export. And you have a strong demand by public spending and weak export in Southern Europe, in which we include France in that case. And on the base of these 5 growth regimes, we try to understand some mechanisms leading to this transformation of growth regimes. And this is where we put in the story what we call growth strategies and welfare state reform. And what do we mean by growth strategy? And Anke and I, as you know, are specialists of public policy in the first place. And we believe that what government do matter a lot. The government is not a black box, just obeying to the pressure of capitalists or obeying to the pressure of electorates. They do things and there are decisions. And these decisions, we try to understand their coherence and their motives. And what we call growth strategy is a relatively coherent series of decisions and reforms taken by either governments or producers groups, economic and social actors, in order to boost growth and stimulate job creation in a specific nation, and the rationale for these decisions, so ideas and decisions. And on the base of this definition, we identify 5 growth strategies which are connected to specific welfare state reforms. So if you have decided to bet a lot for your growth and job creation on the export of high quality manufacturing, then you are obsessed with the control of labor cost, the quality of your good, the skill of your insiders, and it leads to the dualization. You want wage moderation to be accepted by your insider, and you buy that by promising job security, but also promising that around you, the services to firm and services to yourself will be cheap. And this leads to dualization of the labor market, stratification of the skill system, and dualization of social protection. If, on the contrary, you bet on export of dynamic services, you need a highly skilled, general skilled workforce. You need to bet on transformation disruption, so a flexible labor market, but you need also a workforce to be ready for this flexibility, to be equipped for that. And you want a flexible but well-protected workforce, and this is typical what you find in the Nordic countries under the name of social investment, in a way. The third export-led growth strategy is what we call the Fdi Led Growth. It is very much inspired by Dorothee Bolle and Adrian Hagen work, where the nation tried to be both fiscally and socially attractive to foreign direct investment, either coming from the GAFA for Ireland, or coming from German industry for the Visegrad countries, or coming from the Nordic banks for Estonia, for instance. And for that, you want to have a relative control of your labor cost. You compensate for some of the losers of your of this growth strategy, but you also invest on the skill that you need for this. And this is what we call social and fiscal attractiveness. Finally, we distinguish 2 domestic demand-led growth strategies. The one associated with financialization, the famous privatized Keynesianism described by Colin Crouch, easy access to credit, mortgage market, wealth effect, but also universities and the welfare system contributing to feed the beast, to feed the financial beast, in the sense that private education leads to a market of loans. Some of them are really conceived as an asset, some universities, and pension funds, private pension funds, and private insurance play a role in this game. So asset-based welfare. Finally, you have countries that are still believing or betting on public domestic demand. I think of Southern Europe, with more or less success within the European Union. I would say that France is very successful to maintain this kind of model in the very hostile EMU environment. The other Southern European countries are less able to continue to have this model, which rely on high minimum wage, high social spending, public social spending. And this is what we call sometimes social protectionism. And probably we will discuss more on this model with our discussant in the Italian context. What we say here is that some of these southern European countries have been forced to change their growth strategy because of the EU context, and they have been asked to become poorer and to cut in public spending, public jobs, public welfare, and this is what we've called competitive impoverishment strategy, imposed from the outside and imposed especially on Greece, but also partly on Portugal, Spain, and indirectly, as Stefano has shown, on Italy. Okay, if I have, but perhaps you can, I could stop here, but I could also develop this. It depends on the organizer, because I think we have gone very far, but we have a model trying to you just interrupt me because I see my full screen here, but we can propose a model on how to articulate electoral politics on this side and producers group. You know that the current debate on comparative political economy is made of a fierce war between those who claim this is all about electoral politics and others who say this is all about bloc bourgeois, social blocs, capitalists imposing their things. And election are just distraction, as Lucio and Jonas would say. And what we claim is that actually these things, you know, these policies concerning social contribution, human capital formation, etc., it's not either or. It's not either democracy decides or capitalism decides. Actually, when you have a shock, when you have a shock like financialization, ICT disruption, COVID crisis, or financial crisis, you probably are likely to see first producers asking for some adjustment in order to preserve the model. So they asked the government to take some decisions so that they would defend the existing growth regime by implementing a growth strategy and a welfare state reform that is susceptible to preserve the existing growth regime. But when they try to do that, they have to change some of these socioeconomic institutions. We can think here of the Schröder reform, which was really aimed at promoting a further capacity to export in manufacturing export. But this meant, as you know, a change in the labor market, a change in the social protection system, for instance. These reforms have social consequences. They are losers of these reforms. And this is really where we think democracy plays a big role, because the losers, of course, complain, and parties see that. And typically in Germany, the SPD realized that they have made mistakes, and they had to change some of their position and make new proposals, such as a minimum wage. And this is what they come back on government to say, we have to change some things. And here again, you see that government do implement more policies more influenced by democratic pressure, such as the minimum wage in Germany. We could think of many more examples. But of course, once again, this will change the whole setting of institutional setting of the growth regime, which will have probably a consequence on the whole growth regime and the whole model. And I will stop here, thanking you for your attention and for your invitation. And I have to switch off this.
Thank you so much, Anke and Bruno, for this presentation and for your capacity to concentrate a lot of information in a synthetic message. Really, really well done. Now it is the turn of our discussion, and I see Emmanuele ready, so perhaps he will be the first to start.
Gabriele, Luigi is going to be the first.
Luigi, so. Okay, where is Luigi? Luigi, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Anke and Bruno, for this rich presentation that summarizes some of the strengths of the book. It's a very, very rich book on the role of the state and on the role of public policies. And this is one of the important differences between this book and the first wave of book on varieties of capitalism, like, for example, Hall and Soskis and others that focused more on strategic interaction among firms. But I think that the book has many other strengths, and it's a very important book also in comparison with the rest of the literature of today, more recent strands of literature, and in particular, let's say that, I mean, there are two kinds of contribution that are very important as a ground for this book. One, you have already mentioned the contribution of Baccaro and Pontusson that are part also of this book, but also the book of Beramendi is particularly relevant for your contribution, and you combine the two books in a very excellent way. But you not simply combine them, but you also add something very important, and you have already shown some of these strands in the enrichment of this kind of literature. For example, if we take into account the Baccaro and Pontusson contribution, you combine the demand side there that was typical of their approach with the supply side. And I think that this is very, very important, looking at the interaction and the effects of this combination through the social, what you define as socio-economic institutions. Then you enrich the concept of growth model, and you use this concept of growth regime that is, I think, much more useful. It is broader and also much useful than the idea of growth models. And you adopt this concept of growth strategies that is another very useful contribution. And at the same time, you complexify also the typology made by Baccaro and Pontusson. For example, distinguishing the Anglo-Saxon world from the Mediterranean one. And I think all these things are very, very important. And the books give also an important contribution, additional contribution, or let's say make a step further in comparison to the book of Beramendi and others on the politics of advanced capitalism, when, for example, in the chapter of Kathy Thelen, she does a sort of analysis of the trajectories of an intra-model of the Beramendi and others' contribution, what they define as a status-oriented capitalism. And Thelen makes a very well done analysis on the different trajectories inside that model between Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands. So it's a book that I think is a very important book that gives some important additional insights that are very relevant for all the recent comparative comparative political economy literature. But I would like to add something, because I think, I mean, this is the first book, so we are waiting also for the second one. But I want to give to underline 3 points that are not in this first book. I don't know if they are part of the second one, but I think they are particularly important and they are quite complementary to the analysis that you are doing. And especially the first one is related to what you define as all the new engines of growth. And I refer here to the role of industrial policies, because you mentioned industrial policies for example, in the introduction, when you talk about socio-economic institutions, and when you talk about product market regulation, but at the end, in the role played by industrial policies has not been analyzed a lot in the book. But I think, for example, there is Baccaro and Pontusson, who says that the role of industrial policies is declining, is not particularly relevant. But if we look at the role that industrial policies play in the recovery plan of our 3 countries, Germany, France, and Italy, we see that there is a massive amount of investments in industrial policies. And industrial policies are strongly influencing, will probably strongly influence our engines of growth. So I think that focusing a bit more on industrial policies can add and is complementary with the kind of things that you are mentioning. I know that you are quite aware of this because we have this project on digital growth strategies, but still, I think this is very important, because I think that industrial policies are very useful in order to explain the differences between regimes, like, for example, the difference between Mediterranean countries on the one hand and the dynamic services export-led growth model or regimes that you identify, or for example, the high quality manufacturing regimes of Germany. So are important to explain the difference between regimes, but also to explain the difference inside regimes. For example, industrial policies are very useful to explain the differences between Italy and Spain inside the Mediterranean model. So I think this could be a good, I mean, if in the second book there are more room for this kind of things, I think it could be particularly important. With industrial policies in particular, I mean policies for the technological upgrading of firms, or the type of investments made in applied research, or the type of support to the adoption of the so-called key enabling technologies, or policies for cluster, for the merging of cluster in manufacturing activities, or fiscal incentives for technological upgrading or technological innovation, different instruments, different policy instruments for R&D activities, and so on and so forth. So I think that this is my first point. A more detailed attention to industrial policies could be useful. For example, the chapter of talent talk about innovation policies, but it's very brief on this and not particularly detailed. Whilst I think that in the analysis, in the difference between Germany and the Netherlands, the role played by industrial policies is quite relevant. This is naturally the topic of our chapter. And finally, looking at industrial policies can also help us to explain the huge differences in terms of productivity that some of this growth regime has. So, I mean, I think this could be a good suggestions to go further in the analysis in a complementary way with what you have already done. A second suggestion is to focus more the attention on what we could define as regional growth regimes, because usually comparative political economy tend to use to adopt the national level of analysis, and we have already finished the book with Marino Regini and Emmanuele, and we adopted this. So it's very common. I mean, the national level of analysis is important and is a crucial level for all the kind of analysis and policies that you are currently analyzing. So for the welfare, for labor market institutions, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I think that the regional level in terms of growth strategies and growth regimes is particularly important. Taking, for example, the Italian case as an example, naturally, and if you take 4 regions of the Italian case, Piedmont, Lombardy, Emilia-Romagna, and Veneto, for example, you see that they have a very strong specialization in export-led manufacturing activities. So they resemble more your type of growth regime that you define high quality manufacturing export that is more typical of Germany and Austria. And then there are other regions that resemble in a very ideal typical way, the internal demand growth regimes. And with Piedmont, with these 4 regions that are very relevant also by the quantitative point of view, because they have around 24 million of inhabitants, that is twice the population of Sweden. And it's quite interesting to see that this very big area, territorial area, is inside a country in which national institutions are not prone to promote innovation on a national scale, and are not prone to promote innovation in manufacturing. So we have to explain why a large part of the country is following a completely different direction. And this probably means that looking at national institutions and national policies is particularly relevant, but probably it is not enough. So we have also to focus on the regional level of the analysis. But, and here I speak mainly to the Italian audience, I think it's important to look at the regional level, not in a localistic or idiosyncratic way, because it's not important to make the analysis of single region in order to see their specificity. But I think that is important, and this is very complementary with your Bruno and Anke approach, that it is important to see the territorial impact of national policies. Because, for example, in the Italian case, national industrial policies, so industrial policies made at national level have reinforced the territorial disparities and have offered to some regions some instruments and not to other regions. So they are particularly useful looking at the national level of policies and at the territorial impact of that kind of policies. It's particularly important to explain why some region is more competitive than other. So this is the first step, I think, that is important to analyze in the way in which it's important to analyze the regional growth strategies. And the second point is to looking at how regions are currently setting their own growth strategies. Because in some cases, you have regions like Lombardy with about 10 million of inhabitants, so quite a medium country in a certain sense in terms of dimension. That is a rich regions in which you have rich institutions, in which you have quite big firms. So in that case, you may have regional growth strategies that can be quite different from the national one. And this can help us to explain this diversity inside the country. And I think it's also important to look at the interaction between the regional growth strategies and the territorial policies. So how, and the national policies. So how the national policies interact and what kind of consequences this interaction produce in terms of growth models. So I think that the regional dimension is important. If we think in terms of new model or new growth regime in a certain sense. And finally, the third point, I think it's important, and this is particularly relevant for the Mediterranean countries. It's particularly, I mean, you are looking at the role of the state, you are looking at the role of public policies, but I think it's also important to look at the effective institutional capacity of public administration, because the institutional capacity of public administration vary a lot across countries and vary a lot also across regions, for example. And it can help us to explain why specific policies are working in a country but are not working in another. For example, in some cases in Italy and Spain, it is not a problem only of the kind of policies that have been implemented at a national level, so on the type of policies, but it's also a problem of the effective capacity of local administration to implement that kind of policy. So I think that looking at the role of institutional capacity of public administration is particularly important in order to make a better focus on new growth regime, also in very complex kind of policies like those aimed at promoting innovation and research. So I think that including these three kind of dimensions, so a major focus on industrial policies, to an analysis of the role of the regional and the regional growth model, growth strategies, but also the impact of the national policies on the regional level. And third, to focus on the contribution of public administrations in terms of effective institutional capacity in the field of welfare and in the field of industrial policies is particularly relevant. This is very, very complementary to what you have done. And thank you again for this very, very good presentation and for this very, very important book. Thank you, Bruno and Anke. I don't know if Emmanuele, I think it's your turn, no?
Great. Thanks. I'll try to keep my time. I see people are slightly going away, so I'll try to make it faster. I decided just to use a slide. I mean, for the sake of time, I avoid too many compliments to the book. I just can add a couple of things that Luigi already said. I think it's a great book. And it's a great book because it brings fresh air. And what I really like, as Luigi said, is your capacity as editors to put together a lot of different streams of research. So Lucio's work, the previous work on varieties of capitalism, all the debate, as Luigi was saying, about coalitions and how the policy making works. And the financiarization and partially there is a lot of work on the role of industrial policies. So this idea of looking at a book where you are able to merge together welfare policies with politics, and partially, even if there should be more in the future, industrial policies, it's very interesting, and it's what I think comparative political economists we're looking for. So I'm really happy. And for those who have not read the book, what I suggest is, again, read carefully each chapter, because the book is great, but each chapter has insight on specific issues, from Peter Hall chapter to Kathy Jo Martin chapter, Kathy Taylor, and all the others. So it's very good, even if you just want to focus on one specific topic. Having said that, I'll share my screen just very briefly. I've got 5 points. The first one, I mean, some food for thought. The first one, Bruno said it. I'm not totally convinced by the definition of growth strategy that is used in the book. I hope you can see it. I'm not sure. So, I mean, yeah. You quote Mintzberg, but in a book that focuses so much on growth regimes and growth strategy, I think perhaps it's in the second book. I mean, Anke was describing at the beginning, but I like to see more really how these strategies work. I mean, you quote Mintzberg. There is a very nice quote from Mintzberg on how the word strategy comes from Greek and the generals and the strategos, or how you pronounce it. But I would have liked to see more on kind of a muddling through. Okay, you're as you said, you're public policy scholars. There is a lot of research on policy making. And how a lot of times what you risk is some sort of ex post rationalization of what you find. So I think it's there. I mean, you have an efficient way of showing what you mean by strategy, but I would like to see in future work you do together more thoughts on that. And that relates to the second point. Again, I read some time ago articles on process tracing, and Bruno wrote about it. I don't know if it's in the second book, I guess so, because now that I see the structure of the second book, which is about country chapters, and it looks even more interesting than what I thought, because we got, as Anke was saying, we're going to have South Korea, China, Russia, so not just Europe. But in the book, a lot of times I find, I mean, when you explain, or when the authors of the different chapters explain what they find, they quote, of course, other literature, but there is practically almost no process tracing, reconstructing exactly how policy decisions were made. Again, I don't think in a book like this one was possible, but I think it is interesting. Third point is about export-led economies. Bruno, you were saying it, you were quoting Katzenstein before. My point about this, I mean, well, first, one thing that I found very interesting in the book, and Bruno underlined it, is the fact that compared to what, for instance, Lucio says, you show, and Kathy also shows in the book, that, and I guess Anke in her chapter, that Germany was already an export-led economy growth model way before the discussion started about changing in the 90s. So I really read it and I thought about, well, a lot of the literature I read shows that Germany changed after unification. What really interesting showed me in the book is that this is kind of a long-standing tradition of the German economy. And the other country you add here in the discussion in the book is about Japan. But if you look at all the countries which have this kind of a manufacturing export-led model, the two main exceptions of big countries are Japan and Germany. All the others are small countries. And so in a way, what I like to understand more is how come, I mean, for small countries, if you want to be rich, you got to be export-led. Okay, I put it really in a brutal way. You would never have an internal demand big enough to all that. Again, it's part of the argument Katzenstein makes. So really, I read partially, but I'm still puzzled to understand why Germany and Japan are the exception. Okay, all the other big countries are demand. I mean, and again, you're really good in showing there are different models of demand growth regimes and welfare states related. So really it's more explaining the exception than framing for big country model, at least from my perspective. And this works even more since we have a Eurozone. So really what is internal demand in the Eurozone is kind of complicated. Partially, again, there are chapters on that, but really looking at how, for instance, Germany is changing in the recent months, its position, and it could have not been in the book, but on recovery plans. The first impression you have is that Germany is starting to realize that their internal market is Europe. And therefore, how you define where, okay, then Bruno, I'll go back to that. Well, I'm taking too much time. No, I still got a minute. I think that the idea of what is internal demand in the Eurozone is going to be an interesting point on how you define what is internal and what is export. Regions and welfare. Sorry, I don't share it, and then I'm done. Regions and welfare. Yeah, this follows what Luigi just said, especially for countries like Germany and Italy. If you want to look at the interplay between economic growth models and the way welfare state works, for some, not all, I wouldn't say that for France, for instance, but for countries like Germany, Spain and Italy, partially there is also at subnational level, which I think in the future should be more considered in this kind of a comparative political economies analysis. The last point is very short. You define Southern Europe as a high social spending. Some of the feedback you provide, I think, for instance, high minimum wages apply more to a country like France than, for instance, Italy. At the same time, it's kind of hard how you measure high social spending. I mean, if you measure it as a share of the GDP, of course. If you measure it as a per capita purchasing power, Southern Europe has a poor welfare state. Perhaps Italy is different, but if you look at even before the crisis, Portugal, Greece, and partially Spain, per capita social protection expenditure was relatively low. So I've got some problems on how to frame that, but again, forgive me, my role is to be a discussant, so I have to be picky as much as possible to create a discussion, and that's something Bruno taught me several years ago. You have to pick a good book and try to hit where you think you can have a nice and interesting debate for food for thought. So thanks.
You're not always obliged to apply my.
Stefano, it's your turn.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I will, join my distinguished colleagues' praise for the book. Although, of course, I mean, I come third, which also means that a lot of good points have been made. So I will make the bad points in a sense. Again, I mean, praise for the book. It definitely systematizes and advances both empirical and, in particular, analytical knowledge. This has been said, but also, I mean, identifying, nuances. I mean, for instance, Georg Picot's book on additional sources of variation in growth. It also has a dynamic trait, as was mentioned. I mean, the idea of linking growth regimes to growth strategies. Although, and I will like to come back to this. These are recognized as ex post, like Emmanuele was mentioning, but I take a different, I have a different take on this. I will get back to this later. And like was already mentioned, it includes, digital strategies, but in particular finance in the picture, and its three functions. And of course, clearly, I mean, we had a lot of literature on financialization, Cornelia Wuhl, Greta Knipper, after banking, in particular after the financial crisis of 2008. But it was limited to the verge or the border between comparative political economy and international political economy. And you're right in saying that, you mentioning that it hasn't really percolated entirely into CPE, and you do that. And that's a very important service, I think, your volume pays to the discipline, to comparative political economy. And as all important books, it definitely stimulates a lot of questions. And in particular, I mean, I'd like to ask questions on, its ability to travel outside its scope conditions. I mean, it was already mentioned by Anke that you have a second volume with China and Russia. So I would like to know more about how this particular framework, which is built for advanced capitalist countries, how useful can it be, or it is actually, to understand growth strategies or patterns of reforms in developing economies. I mean, I teach engineers from Brazil and India and Uzbekistan, and I teach comparative political economy also, and they ask me, okay, fine, but I mean, how does this apply to Brazil and India, and we discussed that. So I would like to discuss with you. Of course, the scope conditions are in the book title, but I think that there is a lot of travelability, as it were, Sartori-like, of the framework, engines in particular, but also institutions of the economy and components of demand. But I leave this to you. And this links to another general set of questions, right? Yes, I mean, I say that it's a dynamic framework with a focus on growth strategies, but again, I mean, like Emmanuele was mentioning, this is recognized as ex post. So it's more or less coherent patterns of action by governments or producers groups. And it's the role of Minerva flying at dusk, right? Which of course is what is generally done in the discipline, but the risk is at the same time, to have the usual, at best, contingent change bias of comparative political economy, much more refined than usual. See the conclusions with the kind of path-dependent regime-induced reforms, and in the chapters that are there in the first volume, the reconstructions by Cathy Thielen, by Cathy Jo Martin, by Chevalier, that emphasize the political agency, the role of some actors, coalitions, and even at times some divergence from theoretical expectations that, however, are then subsumed under the general framework and explained according to the model. But these trajectories are all recognized at post. And here I sense, or I fear, that something of this very important point you make about the contested political spaces, it may get lost. It may be there in process tracing in the second volume, but this is a sense I have. And in any case, it raises the question on levers that decision makers have to introduce change in a somewhat planned fashion, because it's not all garbage can. It's and you make a very interesting point in the conclusions, building on Culpepper's quiet versus loud politics, and the fact that loud politics tend to be conservative of the status quo in welfare reforms, okay, tends to induce conservative reforms. Still, I would like to hear and see more on political leadership, banking on societal change, exploiting, eroding, and shifting cleavages, and possibly even activating change or introducing change through political supply and novel political strategies. And actually one, and this has been kind of implicitly mentioned by both Luigi and Emmanuele, one possible game changer is the pandemic. Clearly more than the financial crisis has been for fully Sharpian reasons. And it may be a game changer, and I would like to know your opinion about this on, in two senses or along two dimensions. The first is the impact jolting back from routine bias technological change to skills bias technological change, again, as a consequence of the interaction of pandemic and tech change, in particular, projections that show that if remote working should be used, even moderately, all this potential of employment growth that we might have expected in the low-skilled sector, in personal services and so on and so forth, may be stifled. And so, I mean, the new normal, can have a much lower employment growth in the low-skilled service sector than expected. And at some point, generally speaking, you will have to invest in skilled labor force. This will become an imperative even in, let's say, Southern Europe or those growth regimes that are not, and that actually relied, where you could observe empirically lately routine bias technological change, but with the employment growth in low-skilled, let's say, echelon or part of the distribution much higher than in the high-skilled. But most importantly, game changer, pandemic as a game changer in the relegitimation of the role of the state. Public debts are accepted, deficit spending is accepted, state intervention is accepted. You may say, I mean, as long as the ECB is there, with PEP, maybe, or you may say that there's nothing new. I mean, in the Southern European regime, let's call it this way, it will simply jolt back to the pre-constraints era. Still, I'm wondering whether this may have a potential of reshuffling growth regimes via, enabling path-breaking growth strategies. Or you think that it will be just institutional homeostasis, much more refined than in varieties of capitalism, but still homeostasis will be. And actually, here, my last point that resonates with what Luigi mentioned in the end, so I particularly resent this, Luigi, that if you mention that the welfare state offers instruments to governments to reshape and pursue their growth strategies, it can be a game changer. However, institutional preconditions are important. And like Luigi, I would like to stress the importance of administrative capacity, whose analytical role is often not there, not on the radar in comparative political economy, because possibly looking at advanced welfare states, you tend to assume kind of Weberian administrations, but the welfare state is a service bureaucracy. And if you have industrial relations institutions, why not, welfare bureaucracies? And again, I guess this might have to do with the emphasis on strategies as ex post recognizable patterns rather than deliberate planning. But it's not just the planning capacity. So institutional capacity is not just planning capacity, it is also implementing capacity, which resonates with what Luigi was saying. And so on the one hand, you may, and I'm done, you may see some conforming results, conforming to the growth regime, I mean, because they were the effect of low implementing capacity rather than of the constraining, force of the growth regime per se, analytically. And also, I mean, substantively, implementing capacity is what really matters for citizens' life chances. And this is important for your feedback mechanism. So I'd like to see more of that and to discuss this with you. Thank you so much.
Stefano, thanks. I did a kind of a coup d'etat and I took over from Gabriele, so I'm chairing the second part of our discussion. So now the question for Anke and Bruno is, do you want to answer or give us feedbacks, or do you want first to open to the floor to potential questions from, given that is 20 past 7, so we talked all a bit longer, but it was so exciting listening to you and then discussing your book, as you've seen. So do you rather start answering, or should I ask if somebody wants to ask questions, and then we have a first round of questions and feedbacks, as you prefer?
I think we should let people ask. What do you think?
Okay, good. So please. You can directly raise your hand and
yeah, there is.
Oh, sorry, I haven't seen Katharina Bonenberg, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the great talk and the precise overview, and also the great comments. I was wondering what your models and your perspectives mean for post-growth societies. So like climate scientists are actually like kind of sure that in order to like avoid climate catastrophe, like we cannot grow further. So actually the growth models that we face are coming to an end, or have to come to an end. But what does it mean for the growth dependencies and the job dependencies that the welfare states face and that the different welfare states face? And I was wondering whether you can like derive any results already from your perspective on that question. Thanks.
Katharina, thanks a lot. Other questions? Oh, I thank again Bruno, because Bruno already answered some of the questions on the chat meanwhile. And also Jon answered some of the questions from John Stevens. So there's been quite a dynamic interaction in the chat. But others? If you still have to think about it, then, I mean, we can give the floor again to Anke and Bruno.
Shall I start, Bruno? Yeah. So these are really good questions and really good comments, and a lot of food for thought. And thankfully, the second book is not finished yet, so we can incorporate them all into our introduction and maybe conclusion of the second book. And we should actually do so. And I want to start with Luigi's comments on the industrial policy, but also the regional aspect, and then also the administrative capacity. And I think then after that I hand over to Bruno for the other questions. Industrial policy is a really good point, and we did not do that because we concentrated really on growth regimes and the institutional configuration of growth regimes and the welfare state. And obviously industrial policy is not part of the influence of the welfare states or the tools of the welfare state. And we didn't really pay much attention to that. On the other hand, what we also realize in the process of writing the book, but also over the last couple of years when we were doing this, is really how the digital transformation has sped up and has become much faster. And I think you can only really understand the digital transformation and the ICT revolution if you take into account industrial policy. And this is, we all sort of know the work by Mariana Mazzucato. We all know the role of the state and the role of government funding and government funded research organizations for innovation, in particular in the ICT sector. And we know how important this is. But now we are in a situation where the digital transformation is very much driven by tech companies, and where they have sort of liberated themselves from the support of government funding to a large extent. But if we look at Europe, we know that we do not have the technological capacity, and we do not have the innovation which is anywhere near the level of the GAFA companies in the United States, but also not the platform companies in China, who are the other drivers of the digital transformation. And what we now see, at least in Europe, is that how governments are thinking about how they can employ industrial policy in order to, to some extent, to catch up what has been happening in the US and China, and if they cannot catch up, but also how they can protect themselves from the increasingly takeover by tech companies from the US. And that is, we see that if we look at the recovery funds, if we look at this sort of willingness now by governments to become much more interested in industrial policy, which they have not done so for a very long time, both at the European level, but also at the level of member states, and where they think about not only how they can spend much larger amounts of money in order to get to somewhere to a, data sovereignty they're talking about, and other sort of European equivalent instruments or equivalent technological innovation, that Europe can sort of have its own digital transformation, or at least shape its own digital transformation. But this has only emerged over the last 5 years. So it wasn't on our radar screen. It is now much more on our radar screen. And in some chapters of the book, certainly in the Germany chapter, there is a sort of section on industrial policy, on the digital transformation, and how the German government has sort of reoriented itself and what its priorities are in the realm of industrial policy. So this is a very important development, and if we can, we want to pay some attention in the second book, at least in those cases where it's relevant, because it's not relevant everywhere, but in that case it is relevant. The aspect on regional growth regimes is a very good one and a very interesting one. And in particular, I completely agree with you that you can have very different growth models within one country, but you cannot have two different growth regimes. And I think that is the tension which you have, because the institutions, the underlying institutions that are driving and shaping policies, you cannot really differentiate too much to the regional level. You can do it to some extent, but not sort of on the whole. And when you have a growth regime, and when you look for the engine of growth, and if you look to the corresponding institutions, and also when you look where's the demand coming from, then you really have to concentrate on these sectors that are highly productive and highly profitable in your economy. And if you look at the Italian case, we all know that the northern Italian economic structure is an export-led economy, and is very much, and it's also successful in that, but that the overall setup and the growth regime of the overall Italian economy is much more demand-led, and which makes it difficult for the more successful export-led northern Italian regions to really shape the rest of the country. You have very separate economies, and the northern Italian companies are not necessarily so dependent on policies, but where they are dependent is, for instance, investment in skills and investment in training and education. But for a demand-led economy, you do not really need heavy investment in skills, and therefore the Italian government does not prioritize strong investments in education. And the manufacturing-based export-led economy of northern Italy is losing out because of that. So they're suffering. So you get sort of damaging effects if your sort of regional growth models do not correspond to your national growth regime. You can also see that if you look at the example of the UK, where you have where London is the financial center and London is the powerhouse of the UK economy, and it captures most of the value added of the British economy. And you have large regions, in particular in Northern England, but also Scotland, who do not benefit at all from the highly financialized engine of growth of the British economy. And when you see that the depressing and negative effects that has on Northern England, and you see the political reactions against that, of this very imbalanced model where you have a very rich, southern part of England and a relatively poor northern part of England, who do not benefit from financialization, you have a problem, because the asset-based policies and the focus on the financial services industry of the British government damages the rest of the country. And I think these are dynamics which we should look into much more closely. We haven't done so. In Germany, you can also sort of look at it in a similar way. You have the West German manufacturing sector, which drives the export-led growth model of Germany, and you have none of that in Eastern Germany. So Eastern Germany is really losing out, because the growth regime is based on the West German model, which is very reluctant, for instance, in spending, social spending, but in general public spending, is restrained in the German model, and this is really at the disadvantage of Eastern Germany. So you find all these contradictions between growth models and growth regimes when you look at the region level. So this is a very good point, and we should really pay more attention to that. And the final point is about the institutional capacity. And I find it very, very interesting, and we haven't looked at that at all really, because we look at the policies, we look at sort of very stylized policy, looking at education spending or spending on pensions, etc. So we don't really look at the delivery side, and we don't look at the implementation side, and we should do so much more in much more detail, because I think you have a point there that the administrative capacity allows certain policies to be effective and not others. And I think that is particularly the case in education. If you cannot really improve educational standards because your administrative capacity is not up to the task, you actually cannot really pursue a social investment strategy, or it is much harder to pursue a social investment strategy. And that sort of refrains you in sort of pursuing a particular strategy that is based on innovation and ICT spending, etc., because you do not have certain capacities on the ground. So again, this is it's a very good point. We do not do that, certainly not in the first book. I hope we can do a little bit of that in the second book, but we should really do that because it is very good. Bruno, do you want to pick up here?
Yes, thank you very much. I have to finish before the room becomes totally empty, but usual remarks that we get about strategy, and the more I get it, the less I understand it actually. Nobody says that because you have a strategy, you really know what you're doing and you're successful. It's just that you say that you want to do something, you try to do something. So that's the first point. It doesn't mean that your total master plan and you win. I mean, there are losing strategies. The thing is that, and what I put in the chat about strategies, quotes from the book, right, from the first chapters, and trying to say we can identify something ex post indeed, and we want to do that, but not like Hegel's mind of his own, too late and things have changed, but just it's interactive, it's a trial and error, and it's as if the system, the economic system and the political system was reacting and government adjust. Let me give you here the French examples. All the presidents since the early 2000s claim that they want to transform France from what it was to Germany, right? They want France to become an export-led economy. They try to do that. And so they make deregulation, flexibilization, wage control, etc. What happens at the end of each of the mandate? They increase public debt and they increase welfare spending and wages. All of them, they do that. There is a political pressure, economic pressure, leading them back to the past, and therefore you see this kind of back and forth. And same thing, I'm currently finishing the book on social investment in Italy. Renzi tried, and the system, the political, saying no way, we don't need it, we don't want it. So that's probably what we mean by strategy. There is action, there is intention, but it's embedded. The second point is we are great fans of Streckentell and beyond continuity, and you know that change comes through continuity, cumulative but transformative change. And typically, I think the German story is the best one, because it's clear that you have so much effort to preserve the model that you transform it, because you have to change it to preserve it, clearly. The Schroeder reform, these kind of things, is a transformation of the model to preserve it. And the more you do that, and the more you try to adjust it, at the end of the day, you will make path-shifting change. And I think the implementation of a relatively generous minimum wage will change something in the whole system. And they just recently adopted legislation saying that Pflege workers should be better paid, and this was typical of women's jobs that are supposed to be cheap ones, and now they will increase the wage there for the long-term care for the elderly. So, but these are, slow-moving changes, these kind of things. You're right, there is no process tracing in this book. There will be a few in the next one, but I think it's a program for all of us to try to trace the process of this change. But this was not really the purpose of the book. We didn't have the means, the time, the team for doing it, and we hope that some people will do that in the next in the next one. As far as Brazil, India, etc., I think that if you add up further engine for growth, like there is clearly a model that we miss, is the commodity boom kind of model. You know, when natural resources play a role, and this would be true for Alaska, Canada, but also Latin America, and this we should have introduced. Like, actually, Peter Hall mentioned that to us in the beginning, but we didn't have enough case studies on that. On the regional stuff, just to add to what Anke said, welfare states are national regimes. Also, you know, to add on all the points you made about the national embeddedness of regional differences, and even in Italy or in Belgium, you know, that's one of the last thing which remains national is the welfare system. And since we had this entry, it explains partly, but also justifies partly our methodological nationalism, which may be mistaken, but is also explainable by this category. Finally, on the climate change, Katarina, you say we have to stop growth, and I must say that from that point of view, I would be rather pessimistic. We show so much economic and political incentives for promoting growth that I'm very doubtful that we naturally, I mean, things continuing this way, that we can stop looking for growth. Frankly, empirically, we haven't seen any growth strategy that says end of growth will be the thing that we are proposing to you. So, of course, there are some green growth, sustainable growth, some these kind of things which are part of it. You know, trying to invest in, I don't know, smart grids, and electric cars, these kind of things. But it relies a lot on that, and it might be that the Earth stops us much more than endogenously from economic or electoral politics, I would say, or perhaps a big pandemic that will diminish our numbers so that we have less impact on Earth. But I may be wrong. Hopefully, I'm wrong.
Well, with these words of hope from Bruno, we can start, if there is time, and we'll a second round of questions. Thanks again, Bruno, and thanks again, Anke, for your answers and presentation. Are others who like to intervene? This is a good occasion to do it. If not, well, then I don't know if Stefano or Luigi want to add something. Well, then it's been a pleasure to have you both here. Complimenti again for the book. Thanks a lot. And yeah, I agree with what Luigi and Gabriele were saying in the beginning. Let's hope that next time we discuss your work or other research on comparative political economy in person again, hopefully soon. So thanks again for this evening, and on behalf of SISEC, our association, thanks for being here, and thanks for all the participants. Take care, and I hope to see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Always amazed to see this immense Italian crowd up to comparative political economy. This is, and I'm jealous. You know, I cannot gather so many persons in France. So really, bravo, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thanks, Bruno. Thanks, Anke. Good evening.